Hello, everyone. Uh, I want to start by restating that it's an honor to work with such a talented and intelligent group of people. I'll try and I'll attempt to live up to your example. I enjoyed viewing all your presentations this past week, and it was nice to hear from all of you. This past summer, Claudia made a comment to me in conversation that I've been thinking about, ruminating on maybe. So forgive me, Claudia, if this isn't an exact quote, but um, she said something like, "We expose the deepest and most vulnerable parts of ourselves and throw them to the dogs," thinking about the kind of people we were meeting in galleries at times. And I keep thinking about this and the idea of the canvas, paper, the image as a stamp that um, we stamp on. In some unknown indicia of a gallery or a buyer's wall where it's vulnerable and exposed without us there to protect it. I guess this is some kind of a site. I just keep thinking about it. Uh, I don't often think about my images outside the need to make them. Um, they're more of like a catharsis. I've tried several times actually to stop making art, and it never really worked out. I also think about site as, the obvious location. I also like the idea of um, the definition when I Googled it, and it said an area of ground on which a town, building, or monument is constructed. This is my site, this is my home. Um, it's strange to think I bought a house 10 years ago, um, and these are some images of where I live. And I also like looking at these images and thinking of how compartmentalized things are. And I like the idea of our, or at least my site and our way of compartmentalizing, breaking things down, categorizing, and kind of, you know, subcompartmentalizing, and how this really kind of fits into um, maybe the way I function or a lot of us function, and how I used to want to really be a figure painter, but I think that that may be changing, and now rather than the context of the figures just sort of being a stage for the figures, I'm becoming more interested in the sites possibly as the subject. Um, this is a painting that I used to apply to PAFA. It was a self-portrait, interior and exterior. It was titled Conjure. I got the idea. Um, I was watching Discovery Channel. I like. I don't have cable anymore, but when I did, I used to like listening to History Channel and Discovery Channel while I was painting or drawing. And I heard a story about a 12-year-old boy whose parents were trying to decipher the Mayan code, and he broke the code with this symbol. Sorry, it's such poor quality. It's the only one I could find. This was the one he used to break the code, and it was the Mayan symbol for conjure. The idea of the hand in the fish, reaching into another realm and pulling something from it. And I thought, wow, that really, in a lot of ways, um, is the site of any artwork. And I looked through some old paintings, and this is one uh, but where my parents' feet are touching. This is a portrait of my parents, but I wanted to paint my parents, but I didn't want them to be regular portraits. I was really kind of into the idea of narrative. Um, and below their feet is a topical view of the home I grew up in. You can see on my rural suburban streets, lots of fields around. I live in Lancaster County. And the self-portrait was something I visited a lot, and I'm probably going to go back to. And it's just, I like the figure, but I don't like depending on other people in my studio to make work. So a mirror is cheap and it's readily available. So the self as a site, possibly. I also like the idea of the temporal idea of a site. The day is so broken up, going back to the idea of that site as the location for building something. I think more than a physical site, or at least as important, maybe sometimes more important, because you can work anywhere, and it doesn't have to be with typically thought of art supplies, but those of us who are teachers know if you can steal a minute while the kids are working, it's great. But that stealing a minute or an hour is really important, and those nicely defined edges on a calendar like this are all too often blurred, and that's a difficult site to maintain. Here's a couple of images from the first summer, and this was a completely new way of working for me. If you think about the images we looked at before, they were fairly illustrative. You know, I'd work from life and photos, and I'd kind of get an idea, sketch out, you know, different iterations of the idea, and then I'd pick one and just sort of, you know, keep constructing until I got as close to it as I could. But through the taxonomy, things have started to change for me, and I'm not sure where they're going, and I think I tend to revert back to old habits, but don't feel quite comfortable in them any longer. So I would like to revisit the taxonomy and return to some of the things I discovered that first summer, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I wanted to read a quote by Amber Scone, who wrote Quantum Art. I just read that for the thesis, and she says, "The system in which contemporary artists participate is a betrayal to the being of art. The system includes academia, the market, and common sense views of art that are practiced in daily life. There is no other path than to take responsibility for the system. Responsibility entails claiming the ontological question from the artist's point of view and thereby creating an environment for art, which responds to the desires and uncertainty of art." And I think that uncertainty is a fruitful site, if that makes sense. And I'm still trying to not understand it, but maybe embrace it. Again, these are a few images from last summer that were in the proximity show. The one on the right is like a one-shot painting. The one on the left is probably about 3 or 4 paintings. And that process is really what I want to get back to. And something that I think might be a site that kind of ties my former work and this kind of work together is an idea of ambiguity. With everyone else's presentations, I'm really thinking about a lot of other things now, because some ideas were illuminated by all of you, and but I'll try and stick to what I had planned before seeing your presentations. But that idea of ambiguity, my early narrative paintings were sort of a very personal approach, but I kept them deliberately ambiguous. They were more about me working out maybe something um, narratively, and sort of getting it out on the page. And where this is more about a process and embracing the ambiguity, not in necessarily a narrative way, but more directly related to the image. And I have a quote here from an article I found called "The Appeal of Ambiguity in Art." The author's name is Tom Jacobs. It says about he's talking about a study they did where they took people without art backgrounds and showed them various images, and through questionnaires like rated their responses to these images. And it says they note that participants reported flashes of understanding as they studied the work, which they found enjoyable even if they didn't unlock all of its secrets. Insights during the processing of an artwork can be triggered by the ambiguity of an artwork without resolving it. I thought that's really great. Part of this site is that unresolved. I feel like life, that negotiation of trying to find the site, and the time and all of that, there's so much that's just a constant, maybe overused word here, but negotiation. Um, maybe negotiation is a site. Also, in my research last year, I read a lot about phenomenology and Cezanne, and I really like that idea of how we experience through our body, and the idea of trying to dynamically represent that experience. And so that has kind of led to maybe some of the later work from the first summer where I was collaging images. And then this painting that I did last fall of my kitchen window and all that was reflecting in it. And this is an early version of it. I just realized that now. But then I started collaging literally on top of the window, and the finished painting is much more abstract than this. I'll see if I can find a version of that. But also, I've been photographing things that don't fit into categories necessarily, or more that things that are visually dynamic, but they don't possibly inform me on my daily routine in that daily schedule. The center image is a reflection on my classroom floor with the shadow of a student sitting on a stool. It was during the announcements when everyone was looking at the screen, and I thought, wow, it's some really interesting stuff happening on my floor. The first one on the left is my back door, and when I get home at night, my back door faces west, and it gets really intense light coming through a tree I have in my very little backyard. And in the morning, I have light that comes in my classroom as the sun's coming up, and it plays on the screen and coming through the trees, and some of what's happening there dynamically, without naming, is really interesting and beautiful. And then now I just, sinned and told you what it all is. I'm also right now working on this drawing. It's a little further along than this. And this is my studio looking through my living room. Well, actually, my home is sort of like a shotgun setup. I never use the front door. That's where my studio is. That would be what's supposed to be the living room. What's supposed to be the dining room is my living room. And then it's the kitchen. And so I like that idea of moving through dark into light and back into dark. And that started as a study for the figure painting I posted that all of you have seen, and her background was not working out, and I think she's going to get painted out, and this will just be a painting of the space in my home. We'll see. I've also, going along with that idea of sight, I'm trying to establish, different approaches, but somehow try to merge them. So these are just real quick little sketches. These are very small. I was doing them last year, and I started doing them again. I think of them as an assignment. So I give myself an assignment. I have to do a couple of these a day, and so I'm just drawing my home and windows and rooms that, entrances and exits. And I kind of like these. This is one of my setups from last year. I like the, phenomenological idea of, painting what you observe, but observation is so dynamic that these setups that I started this summer were kind of an extension of the collages from last year. The one on the left was a collage that I had put in a frame, and it was the first one that made me start thinking this way. And when I started painting the collage in the frame, I noticed the reflection of the window behind me, and so I started playing around this past summer with some glass I found in the trash and scraps of wood, mylar, and I think I'm going to continue with this, and somehow the idea of working with the taxonomy, these built sort of still lives, um, and the direct observation, three different kind of ideas that I'm trying to bring together, so that idea of sight, looking, and how I can play with how dynamic it is to observe something. I also like the idea of the sight as meditative. Working observationally is kind of a meditative process, and going back to the idea of our busy schedules and our fragmented lives, it's nice to slow down and really focus on something that you want to focus on.